Have you ever had a feeling about someone and then later realized you were right? Maybe you couldn't explain it. Nothing obvious had happened. The person hadn't necessarily done anything wrong, but something inside of you said, pay attention. And then there are other times when you have a strong feeling about something and you're completely wrong. So here's the question. How do you know the difference between intuition and emotion? And perhaps, even more importantly, where does common sense fit into a spiritual journey? Because spirituality without discernment can become dangerous. And common sense without intuition can leave you ignoring some very important messages within. So today, we're going to talk about something I think doesn't get enough attention in the spiritual community. The relationship between common sense, intuition, discernment, and spiritual growth. And stay with me because toward the end, we're going to talk about one of the biggest mistakes people make when they believe they're following their intuition. So, what is common sense? Let's start with something very simple. Common sense is essentially our ability to look at a situation and recognize what is practical, reasonable, and grounded in reality. If someone tells you, I'm going to give you $10,000, but I need your bank account password, common sense should kick in. You don't need a psychic reading. You don't need a tarot card. You don't need to meditate for 3 hours. You need common sense. And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is simply say, no, that doesn't make sense. That's important because spirituality should not require you to abandon your ability to think critically. In fact, I'd argue that real spiritual maturity often makes you more discerning, not less. You become more aware of patterns. You become more observant. You start noticing how people behave rather than simply listening to what they say. You become better at recognizing when something feels aligned and when something feels completely wrong. And that brings us to intuition. Intuition is different from common sense. Common sense might say, this situation doesn't logically add up. Intuition might say, something about this situation doesn't feel right. And sometimes you can't immediately explain why. That's what makes intuition so fascinating. You might walk into a room and immediately feel uncomfortable. You might meet someone and feel unusually safe around them. You might receive an opportunity that looks perfect on paper, but something inside of you says, don't do it. Or you might have an opportunity that scares you. Everything inside says, this is risky. But another quieter voice says, go. And here's where things get complicated because not every feeling is intuition. Read that again in your mind. Not every feeling is intuition. Fear can feel like intuition. Anxiety can feel like intuition. Trauma can feel like intuition. Desire can feel like intuition. Even ego can disguise itself as intuition. And that's why spiritual growth requires something called discernment. Let's talk about one of the biggest questions people ask. How do I know whether it's intuition or fear? There isn't always a perfect answer, but there are patterns. Fear often feels urgent. Do it right now. Get out immediately. Something terrible is going to happen. You can't trust anyone. Fear tends to create mental noise. It starts producing scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if they leave? What if I fail? What if everything falls apart? Intuition can sometimes be much quieter. It's more like something isn't right, or wait, or this isn't for you, or even go. There isn't necessarily a long story attached to it. There's simply an inner knowing. And here's something interesting. Sometimes intuition doesn't tell you why. It simply tells you what to pay attention to. That's why patience matters. You don't always have to act immediately on a feeling. You can observe. You can gather information. And then you can see whether that inner feeling continues to make sense as more information becomes available. I think this is where spirituality can become more balanced. You don't have to choose between I trust my intuition and I'm a logical person. You can be both. Think of it this way. Common sense gives you grounding. Intuition gives you awareness. Discernment helps you decide what to do with the both. Imagine you're considering taking a new job. Your intuition says, something about this opportunity feels right. Great. Now use common sense. What is the salary? What is the commute? What are the benefits? What's the company's reputation? Why is this position open? What does the contract say? What are the expectations? You don't have to throw logic out the window just because something feels spiritually significant. Your intuition can open the door. Your common sense can check what's behind it. And that's the powerful combination. Sometimes people begin a spiritual journey and start looking for signs everywhere. A number appears repeatedly. A song plays at the right moment. They see a particular animal. They have a dream. They notice a coincidence. And these experiences can absolutely feel meaningful. But here's where discernment becomes important. A meaningful coincidence doesn't automatically mean the universe is telling me exactly what to do. Maybe it is meaningful. Maybe it isn't. Sometimes the healthiest response is simply interesting. I'll pay attention. Not, this must be a cosmic command. You don't have to turn every coincidence into a prophecy. Sometimes a sign is simply a sign that says, pay attention. It doesn't necessarily tell you what happens next. That's where your judgment comes in. So let's be honest. Sometimes people desperately want something to be true. They want this relationship to work. They want that job to be their destiny. They want that person who hurt them to come back. They want a particular outcome. And then they start interpreting everything through that desire. They see a repeated number and think, this means they're coming back. They have a dream and they think, this proves we're connected. They see a tarot card and think, the universe confirmed it. But what if you're simply seeing what you desperately want to see? That's why spiritual growth requires humility. You have to be willing to say, I might be wrong. That sentence is incredibly powerful because the moment you're willing to admit you could be wrong, you become much more capable of seeing things clearly. One of the biggest misunderstandings about intuition is that you simply have it. But intuition becomes easier to recognize as you become more self-aware. Think about your own patterns. What does fear feel like in your body? What does excitement feel like? What does anxiety feel like? What does genuine peace feel like? What happens when you're ignoring your own boundaries? What happens when you're around someone who isn't being honest with you? What happens when you're doing something that is genuinely aligned with who you are? The more you understand yourself, the easier it becomes to recognize your own internal signals. Your intuition may not be getting louder. You may simply be getting quieter. That is a major difference. Sometimes intuition was there all along. You were just too overwhelmed to hear it. This is where people become more aware during spiritual growth. You might notice physical sensations when you're making a certain decision. Maybe your shoulders tighten, your stomach drops, you feel restless, or perhaps you feel unexpectedly calm. But again, don't automatically label every physical reaction intuition. Your nervous system reacts to many things: stress, fear, excitement, past experiences, uncertainty. So instead of saying, my stomach dropped, therefore this person is bad, you might say, my body's reacting strongly. Let me investigate why. There's a much healthier approach. Your body can provide information, but information isn't necessarily the final answer. Here's another important distinction. Intuition and impulse aren't the same thing. Impulse says, I want it now. Intuition may say, this matters. Impulse wants immediate gratification. Intuition can actually ask you to wait. Sometimes intuitive decision is one that requires patience. You might feel drawn towards something, but also sense, not yet. And that's difficult for people. We're living in a culture obsessed with immediate answers. We want certainty. We want confirmation. We want someone to tell us, yes, this is your sign. But spiritual maturity often looks more like, I don't know yet. I'm going to observe. And that is not weakness. That's wisdom. If common sense is grounded in practical reality and intuition is your inner awareness, then discernment is the bridge between them. So discernment asks, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling it? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? Am I afraid? Am I hopeful? Am I projecting what I want? What would I tell someone I love if they were in this exact situation? The last question is incredibly powerful because sometimes we have excellent advice for everyone except ourselves. Here's something nobody likes to hear. Sometimes your spiritual journey isn't going to give you more signs. It's going to require you to make a decision without one. And that can be uncomfortable. You may meditate. You may pray. You may journal it down. You may pull some tarot cards. You may ask for guidance. And still, nothing. No dramatic sign. No lightning bolt. No unmistakable message. What do you do then? You use everything you've learned. You look at facts. You listen to your inner voice. You examine your emotions. You consider the consequences. And then you make the best decision you can. Maybe spiritual growth isn't about learning how to predict the future. Maybe it's about learning how to trust yourself while walking into an uncertain future. Think about that. That's completely different kind of spirituality. Now, let's get to the really interesting part. What happens when your intuition and common sense disagree? Suppose you meet someone, your intuition says, I don't trust this person. But objectively, you don't have enough evidence to conclude they're dangerous. Don't ignore the feeling. But don't automatically accuse the person either. Instead, slow down, observe, set some boundaries, gather some more information. Let time reveal what it reveals. That's the mature response. You don't have to choose between paranoia and blind trust. There's a third option, awareness. You can say, I don't know what's happening yet, but I'm going to pay attention. That's discernment. This might be one of the most important points of the entire video. Sometimes we're waiting for a mystical answer, and when the answer is painfully obvious, someone repeatedly disrespects you. That's information. Someone consistently lies. That's information. A business opportunity requires you to ignore obvious red flags. That's information. A relationship consistently destroys your peace. That's information. But keep saying, but you keep saying, but I feel spiritually connected to this person. Maybe. But spiritual connection doesn't automatically make a relationship healthy. And that's an important distinction. Chemistry isn't compatibility. Excuse me. Intensity isn't intimacy. A spiritual feeling isn't permission to ignore reality. Sometimes spiritual lesson is simply learning to stop abandoning yourself. If your spiritual journey is making you increasingly afraid of ordinary life, that's worth examining. If it's making you believe every coincidence is a supernatural message, examine that. If it's causing you to ignore evidence because someone told you, trust the universe, stop and think. Spirituality shouldn't require you to surrender your critical thinking. It should ideally help you become more conscious, more compassionate, more observant, more honest with yourself, more willing to face uncomfortable truths. And sometimes the truth isn't mystical at all because it's incredibly ordinary. This isn't working. I need to leave. I need to apologize. I need to slow down. I need to stop making excuses. I already know the answer. There is something beautiful about becoming familiar with your own inner voice, not the voice of fear, not the voice of ego, not the voice of society telling you who you're supposed to become, but the quieter voice underneath all of that. The one that says, you know this isn't right. Or, you know you're ready. Or, you need to let this go. Or, it's time to begin again. And sometimes that voice doesn't feel dramatic. It feels simple, almost boring. That's one reason people miss it. They're waiting for something profound. But wisdom can be incredibly quiet. So let's make this practical. The next time you get a strong feeling about something, ask yourself 5 questions. What exactly am I feeling? Don't just say, I have a bad feeling. Name it. Is it fear, excitement, peace, suspicion, grief, pressure, jealousy, hope? Naming the emotion can separate it from intuition. The next question, what evidence do I actually have? Not what you imagine, not what you hope, not what somebody told you. What do you actually know? Question 3. What would common sense say if your best friend described the situation to you? What would you tell them? Question 4. What happens if I wait? This is a powerful one. Sometimes you don't need an immediate answer. The time is an incredible truth detector. Question 5. Does this decision move me towards peace, integrity, and self-respect, or away from them? That doesn't mean every right decision feels comfortable. Sometimes growth is uncomfortable, but there's a difference between healthy discomfort and repeatedly betraying yourself. Maybe the spiritual journey isn't about becoming someone who knows everything. Maybe it's about becoming someone who can sit comfortably with uncertainty. Maybe it's learning to say, I don't know. I'm going to wait. I need some more information. This doesn't feel right. I was wrong. I need to change direction. I'm no longer available for this. Those are spiritual statements too. Because spirituality isn't only about meditation, manifestation, astrology, tarot, synchronicities, or signs. It's also about how you live, how you treat people, how you treat yourself, how honestly you face reality, and whether you have the courage to act on what you already know. So if you take anything away from today's conversation, let it be this. Don't abandon common sense in the name of spirituality. And don't dismiss intuition simply because it can't always be explained logically. Use both. Let common sense keep you grounded. Let intuition keep you aware. Let discernment help you tell the difference. And let time reveal what you cannot see. Because sometimes the universe, or life, or your higher self, or simply your own wisdom doesn't give you a giant neon sign. Sometimes you get a subtle feeling, a moment of discomfort, a quiet realization, a pattern you can't ignore anymore. And eventually you realize you knew. You just weren't ready to listen. And maybe that's the real spiritual journey. Not learning how to hear more signs, but learning how to recognize the truth when it finally becomes quiet enough for you to hear it. So the next time your intuition speaks, don't immediately obey it. And don't immediately dismiss it either. Pause, listen, check the facts, use your common sense, watch the patterns, and then ask yourself, what is this trying to teach me? Because sometimes intuition isn't giving you the answer. Sometimes it's giving you an invitation to become more aware. And that may be one of the most important parts of the spiritual journey. If this topic resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had an intuitive feeling that turned out to be completely accurate? Or have you ever mistaken fear, anxiety, or wishful thinking for intuition? Tell me your experience below. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did and you found it to be helpful, subscribe, comment, like, share. All this helps the channel to grow. And until the next time and the next video, I love you guys. I will talk to you soon.